Today, we're talking about what lurks in your endpoints and discuss practical ways to address security from both the technical and human angles. We'll talk about endpoint risk, shadow IT, tool sprawl, and practical strategies for layered security. It is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so we're making sure to lean into ways to help you out. It's Wednesday, October 29th, 2025, and I'm Dave Sobel. Welcome to the Business of Tech Lounge, the live version of the Business of Tech podcast. Today, sponsored by ConnectWise. We'll be welcoming questions and comments throughout the show, so make sure to put them into the Q&A box of On24. If you have a question, we will happily respond to it. Now, some housekeeping items to get us all rolling through the day. If you think you're having any kind of audio issues, make sure to check your device volume, both on the device itself and the On24 interface, or refresh your screen, because we know that takes care of most of the problems. Your first best debugging step for anything going on with connectivity is make sure you're using Google Chrome and try out incognito mode if you think you're having connection problems. We are definitely taking Q&A, so make sure to use the Q&A panel to submit your questions and use the attendee chat to talk to other audience members. Feel free to use those reaction buttons. They'll help us know how we're doing. Yes, there will be a recording of the webinar, which you'll get in a few days via email. And by the way, best of all, for those of you submitting questions in Q&A, that automatically enters you to win a $100 gift card. So make sure to keep those questions coming. Now, I want to introduce my esteemed panel for today to give you a sense of who we're talking to. I've got three great panelists, and I'm going to introduce each one of them. Jim Peterson is the product marketing manager for cybersecurity at ConnectWise, where he specializes in helping managed service providers enhance their cybersecurity offerings, profitability, and client trust. He's got deep expertise in both cybersecurity solutions and MSP business strategy, and he's known for translating complex security challenges into actionable strategies for IT leaders. Jim, welcome to the show.
Great to meet you. Thank you.
Ashley Finch serves as the technical sales engineer at ConnectWise, focusing on endpoint security and risk management for IT service providers. He brings hands-on experience in designing and supporting security solutions that address the realities of tool sprawl, shadow IT, and compliance challenges. Ashley, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Very much looking forward to the discussion today.
And Jamie Woodruff is widely recognized as Europe's #1 ethical hacker and a leading authority on cybersecurity, having uncovered vulnerabilities on high-profile platforms such as Facebook, Google, and Kim Kardashian's website. Jamie is renowned for his real-world penetration testing, social engineering demonstration, and the ability to reveal hidden risks lurking in modern IT environments. Jamie, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here.
Now, let's mix it up, gents. I want to start a little bit to talk about the endpoint explosion. Like, endpoints are multiplying at just a faster rate than we've ever seen before. When you combine remote work with BYOD, with IoT, and all of the deployment of SaaS, it's all come up to resulting in more endpoints. So I want to get a little bit of a discussion about some of what those major changes are. I wanted to note a data point. Shadow IT has surged by 59% since remote work became mainstream, with nearly half of cyber attacks linked to shadow IT. Jim, I'm going to start with you here. You work with hundreds of MSPs through ConnectWise. What are you seeing as the biggest shift in how endpoints are showing up in those client environments over the, say, past 18 months?
The past data, it's really continuing to grow, right? When we think of the traditional endpoint, the business user's experience, or a laptop or desktop or a workstation, those are still growing and still being replaced at a pretty frequent rate. But with bring your own device, with the expansion of different ways, Internet of Things, different endpoints that people can work on to try to get their jobs done or access information, we're just seeing more and more explosion. And unfortunately, a lot of those just aren't protected.
Are there particular things that are catching MSPs most off guard?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that catches MSPs off guard is we're still in that mindset of just protecting the things in the four walls. We think about those as being the devices we have to protect. But with the way businesses are working today, data is everywhere. It's across multiple different platforms, across different endpoints. And we forget about really putting security in to protect holistic business, not just the endpoint itself.
Gotcha. Now, Ashley, I got to ask, from a technical perspective, when MSPs come to you and say they're drowning in endpoints, is there a root cause there? Is it visibility? Is it management? Or is it something else entirely?
Yeah, it's a combination of both of those things. So you've got kind of multiple platforms that are managing these technologies. You've got multiple tools that can help solve those issues. So it's a case of, okay, where do you look first? There's a lot of platforms that can help with that. But ultimately, with all these different tools, they're disconnected. They create blind spots, and that could be a kind of a great entry point for attackers to get a foothold and potentially kind of exploit some of those different technologies that these organizations are using.
Gotcha. Now I got to know: is there an unexpected category like of endpoints that you see MSPs struggle the most with?
It can vary, but I also say in terms of on the technical side, we've got the kind of the traditional kind of endpoints, but you're going into kind of SaaS applications, even kind of likes of shadow AI now. So you've got all these different kind of platforms like ChatGPT, Copilot, potentially organizations sharing data to these as well. So it's not only looking at, as Jim says, within these four walls, but other platforms outside of that as well.
Gotcha. Now, Jamie, I would think when you're scoping the way of using, penetrating an organization and thinking about the get in, that those endpoints that the organization didn't even know existed are prime targets. Like that feels like some of the best way. Can you share some of the ways that forgotten or shadow endpoints become the easiest
Yeah.
targets?
So I think a very good point to mention as well. So obviously, when you spoke to Jim previously, Jim mentioned BYOD. We have a lot of policies now around BYOD, but I'm seeing companies get compromised by BYOC. So you might think, okay, well, what's that? Well, bring your own cable devices to work. How many people in this virtual audience essentially that brings their own technology in terms of charging cables directly into that organization, and there's no policy, in relation to doing that. I've known businesses be compromised because one of the employees purchased a cable from a malicious site. That cable had an embedded SIM card directly built into the cable that allowed attackers to remotely call that number, listen to conversations within a 10-meter radius of what was going on, but also was acting a little bit like a rubber duck, where it was doing a macro series of events to try and download ransomware, to try and download, execute, and deploy ransomware just via a cable. So there's a lot of things that you have to kind of take into to impact around this. And then moving on towards the kind of shadow IT side of things, this has been happening now for about 4 to 5 years, but becoming way more paramount in terms of our capabilities and scopes for remote working.
Gotcha. Now I gotta ask a little bit more about shadow IT. Then talk to me a little bit about the way you look at it, about the way that that increase in attack surface and how it helps facilitate better social engineering
Yeah.
attacks.
So, I mean, once over the day, if we were doing some reconnaissance, there's many different websites where we could, find data about individuals from historic data dumps and then compile them together, and then we'd ultimately get key facts like, their children's details or pets details or any information that we can use to kind of conduct that social engineering type of attack. And then we used to use different services like Pastebin as an example, where we could look through for like developers doing PHP scripts or any internal API integrations, and they'd post code online to then share that in an email. Then obviously, after COVID, during that kind of remote working period, we utilized AI a lot in terms of, debugging, going through large data sets to be able to do our job more competently, but faster ultimately. Well, all that data, a lot of it is being shared with like non-commercially viable applications, which then harvest and own or utilize that data to then resell for further models. But you've got people publicly posting like API keys, for instance, for like their AWS services. You've got like keys in relation to their SMTP external connections of what they're integrating with. So from a social engineering perspective, we can use readily available software out there to be able to run all the way around the internet, collectively, grab all this information that you've publicly shared or posted. A really good example would be how OpenAI, a simple change to a robot file, that's it, to kind of hide all their shared URLs a couple of weeks ago. All the chat history has got publicly posted online of what people were asking, what questions and what data that they were inputting. And they weren't putting stuff like, hi, can you reword this email to Dave, please? They were putting the entire email headers, footers, like all this information that's identifiable directly into these kind of AI solutions. So I think it's becoming more kind of paramount now in terms of like the reliability and scalability of utilizing AI, but also the cost effectiveness. We don't have to spend $20,000 or $40,000 to use an AI model per month. We just sign up for as little as $10 to be able to utilize these technologies, and I think that's the scary implication of it.
Gotcha. Now, Ashley, I got to ask a little bit about the tech side of this again, because I would think that those unmanaged SaaS apps and device sprawl, like that's going to cause a lot of data protection problems, issue with incident response. Give me a little bit of a sense of the tech impact of that additional set of unmanaged apps.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, as you mentioned, there's lots of different apps that can help the organization kind of move business forward, but at the same time, for the IT team trying to manage it, keep up with the growth of the organization, it can be quite difficult. And you've got these applications that employees might have used at a previous organization. So they kind of sign up to try and kind of get into that platform. And ultimately, the IT team aren't involved, don't have control of it, and don't know where that data is going to. So in the event of an attacker trying to look at that organization, they find kind of this data on the platform is not protected. It's maybe not even backed up by the IT team. So potentially that could be kind of a loss to the organization. So really kind of having visibility of all of those kind of technical platforms that they're using and the controls that manage it is critical for the IT team.
Gotcha. Now, Jim, this got to bring up the other side of this, because this is the business side. There's operations, there's budget impacts, like as the tool sprawl and as you get lack of visibility hits there. Tell me a little bit about the way that that's impacting the business side of operations.
If we think of a couple different things, so tool sprawl versus the shadow IT solutions, we have a challenge from a budgetary perspective, but it kind of goes outside of the actual cost of them. So tool sprawl is going to cost money, right? We're buying tools that we're maybe not using effectively or used effectively at one point that have gone out of favor and we switched and we haven't done a great job of decommissioning those solutions. The shadow IT side affects us a little bit different in budgeting because just like Ashley and Jamie were talking about, there's the malicious concern, right? I deploy a solution that is unauthorized by my IT department and I'm using it and someone else can gain access to that information. Then there's the protection like Ashley was talking about. The budgetary impact of lost data is significant. So when we think about the ability of a shadow IT environment accessing or holding this information that a business can't recover. Yeah, really good point. Jamie's going to jump in here in just a second. But we have this challenge that shadow IT and tool sprawl are very expensive, but they're often so overlooked. We think of them as small charges, but the impact of that lost information is significant.
Jamie,
Yes.
you wanted to add to that? Because
Yeah,
I know
sorry, I wanted to add. I'm really sorry. A good example would be I worked with a company about 3 weeks ago, and they didn't have the budget for all the advertising screens, internally in their organization. And their IT guy just went out, bought a lot of Raspberry Pis, installed them like cheap, cost effective, and then all of a sudden, the web port's accessibly publicly, not internally. They're running an outdated SSH version. There was no jailing. There's nothing at all, and they got compromised just because the IT individual just going out and doing this thing. Now, in his mindset, when we spoke about it, during the breach, we went through the policies and what they had internally. And it's almost like an interview phase from a forensic perspective to how did we get to this particular point. And he wanted to save the company money. He wanted to go out of his way to tinker. He didn't realize the implications of what could happen. And it was picked up by Endpoint Security. It was there directly in their panels, in terms of how the data was being transmitted. But again, he did that in the best interest of the organization. And you find a lot of IT people do this. They tinker around with different technologies, different integrations, because not only do they want to make their job easier because there's a lot of data that they have to manage, but also it gives them a lot more output in terms of scope of operationally how the organization's running. So it's really interesting talking about shadow IT. It's got a whole different remit of categories that we can delve down.
Yeah, I mean,
And
shadow IT is one of the. I want to cite two data points here for it. Organizations are typically running 3 times more SaaS applications than IT even realizes, and 38% of IT administrators cite the inability to discover all employee applications as a critical roadblock to them delivering on that security promise. Like, Jamie, as you frame and think about that, like, are there ways that when employees bypass the official channels and install their own tools, like, are there particular tactics that then attackers use to compromise those endpoints?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is, I mean, to put an example, my morning was spent actually going through 3,500 installed applications just on a small SME, and they have about 65 employees. So they're going through Cyber Essentials at the moment. So I'm having a look in terms of, do they need that software capability? But there was about 14 different PDF editors that I identified going through the actual application element to it, and some of which was built by people many years, many moons ago that are no longer supported, that are completely, outdated. But in terms of like from an MSP perspective, it's very difficult because we're monitoring their endpoints, we're monitoring the kind of web solutions, the server solutions, like all the capabilities in terms of infrastructure. But ultimately, if you think just a small organization like that with the amount of applications installed, it's very difficult to kind of self-manage. And we do rely across, different kind of endpoint solutions or automations to make sure that everything that is installed is within kind of the remit of the policies and procedures that we set. But I mean, there's companies that still aren't being patched for like 2 months, 3 months in terms of scope, which is ultimately ridiculous.
Gotcha. Now, actually, I got to ask the detection sort of side of this, like, and it's kind of almost a two-part question. My broader one, and Paul's gonna have a follow-up, like, specific portion of that. Like, can MSPs even discover shadow IT endpoints if users are hiding them or don't report them? And Paul wants to know, like, what role should endpoint level DLP play in identifying and containing those shadow IT risks before they escalate?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, endpoint DLP can certainly has its place in that. So I'd be able to try and see first of all what is on that device in the first place. What are the list of those installed applications? Do you have 11 different PDF readers, as Jamie's pointed out, for that organization? So the first key thing for the tool is to provide visibility, identify what there is, because if you don't have visibility, you don't know what there is, you don't know what to protect, what to even prevent. And then goes on to the next stage of actually having some sort of effect on the organization, some mitigation for that. So for example, you've got kind of things like RMM tools to identify what apps are on there, also to help manage from installation and also removal as well. And then
Gotcha. Now, Jim, I got now that we've sort of laid out this tool sprawl problem, I need to talk a little bit about the dirty secret of our industry, which is tool sprawl. MSPs are running 8, 10, sometimes 15 different security tools. I spoke to one provider recently who's running 40 different ones. So what's the business case for consolidation? Like, where do you see the biggest ROI when MSPs simplify their stack, and what's the right number of tools? Jim, I'm going to have you to weigh in here. There we
No,
go.
this is a really great question because as we're moving consistently right into the future of technology, we've been doing this forever. We got to say, well, where are we going when we have multiple tools that have context switching challenges, trying to keep up with alerts and where they're landing? When we look forward, we're saying, how do we get under a platform to really help solve the challenge of efficiency that we expect MSPs to start to go into, especially when they're running a large amount of applications. Ashley mentioned RMM, Jamie mentioned patching. Those two are obviously hand in hand because one helps support the other and then identifying applications. When we think of tool sprawl, it's really quick. As the MSP industry, are really quick to solve the next problem with the next application. But when we start to say, well, how do we bring it all together, put it under one visibility of a roof to try to make sure our team has one place to go to try to pull information as much as possible. So when we look at the future of tool sprawl, what we're trying to say is, well, if we have to have 40 applications in the future, and I hope we don't, to protect our SMB partners, how do we get that under one view so we can really start being efficient with that? Because the cost is one thing, just like we talked earlier, the budgetary cost is one thing. The time of management of each of those applications, keeping them updated, making sure they're doing what they're supposed to do and that they're being effective. That's a major cost that gets divided up significantly over time.
Gotcha. Now, Jamie, I would think that the tool sprawl side of things and an engineer's mindset of bringing in more and more tools. This feels like this would be
Yeah,
great for attackers, right? This feels
yeah,
like just the opening the door of it. Tell me a little. I'm sure you've got some stories and some ways that tool sprawl problem
yeah.
opens doors for hackers and social engineering attacks.
Yeah, so do you know what? I actually had this conversation yesterday, and This the company that I do a little bit of consultancy work for as an MS. They're an MSP, and they're constantly, putting like EDR solutions, then another EDR solution, then another solution, then another solution, because they're paranoid in terms of what they're looking after for, the end user perspective or their client. And to me, it's far too much, because it opens that attack vector massively in terms of the patching side of things. But also, I've seen different solutions interact with each other in different ways. So, when one's flagged something as, say, like a polymorphic virus, for as an example, or polymorphic different data type for malware, another solution is kind of whitelisted and allowed it, because it's already been whitelisted and allowed further down the line when essentially it shouldn't. Now, the problem that you've got is, people work with a whole lot of vendors. Like, organizations need everything in terms of kind of like their continuity solutions to their patching vulnerability management side of things. But one thing that we kind of always forget is we constantly patch, systems, say, on a weekly basis, right? I hope it's less than that, but let's be realistic, on a weekly basis, right? But we never patch the people. If you think about it, we don't, right? We never apply a patch. We never teach them about all these different types of vulnerabilities, or the landscape from, a low level employee or executive all the way up to kind of senior or C-level executive. It's very difficult to kind of educate that element of the individuals inside the infrastructure. So just constantly layering different elements of solutions, one after another. First, you've got the human factor, the misconfiguration, which is one of the main ways into an organization, is via misconfigured endpoints, or misconfigured protections. But then also the human factor, like phishing campaigns, different types of stuff that we're seeing now emerging out. So I personally feel the more stuff that you guys add, I mean, it's great for me, because it's more data points that I can use to try and exploit into an organization. So, it's finding that kind of balance between, okay, if someone's attempting to break in, we need a kind of window. And normally I say, if they can't break in within, say, 45 minutes to an hour, it's not targeted, it's an automated attack, or what we call a drive-by based attack. They'll move on to the next target. And majority of stuff nowadays is automated testing. It's not someone sat there trying to break in, but that does happen. So it's about having that kind of layered security and that layered protection, but not going completely overkill that restricts your organization in terms of the growth strategy side, and kind of finding that a balance. So.
Gotcha. Now I'm going to, for our listeners, I can note those. Keep those questions coming in. Reminder: you'll be entered to win a $100 gift card for every when you throw in your question into the queue there. But Ashley, I've got to ask you, like from an engineering perspective, it seems like there's even more problems with more tools than just cost, right? It feels like it actually would make implementation of the engineering processes alone more complicated. That it would definitely impact your ability to deliver. Like, are there concerns there? And what breaks first when you have too many tools?
Yeah, so ultimately, you kind of if the more tools you have, you're spreading yourself thinner and thinner across all these different platforms. And also, these platforms as well, they might overlap with each other. It's a case of, do I configure it in platform A, platform B? So it can ultimately depend on the engineer that's kind of configuring it. And from these different technologies as well, you're getting all of these different alerts that are coming in to kind of your PSA type systems, emails. And so effectively, these teams are being kind of overwhelmed with different alerts. Okay, which platform do I look at first? Which one's the most important? And there's only a certain amount of time in the day. There's only so many people in the organization. So these teams are kind of working to the maximum, but they're constantly on the back foot. They're constantly trying to address these challenges. But when you've got such kind of siloed information, siloed platforms, it makes it a real challenge for these teams to manage on a day-to-day basis.
Gotcha. Okay. So we've got too many endpoints and we've got too many tools. So we already know we've established those two problems. That's actually going to create our next problem, which is the massive tsunami amount of alerts that we're dealing with. Despite increased cybersecurity budgets, most organizations still struggle with limited visibility and uncontrolled data exposure. So, Ashley, I got to sort of start with you here. Alert fatigue really is overwhelming SOC teams and MSP techs. If you're getting 10,000 alerts today and missing the critical ones, you're not going to be effective. Like, are there recommendations you have for tuning signal in, out from the noise? Like, what do MSPs get wrong, and what's the first filter they should apply to deal with alert fatigue?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key factors is that you've got loads of different alerts that you can turn on in these platforms. Okay, great. I'll turn everything on at once, but it's okay. It's great to have that visibility, but it's the processes behind it in terms of what that alert actually means for the organization. So they've got, I don't know, 10 different alerts that have come in first thing in the morning. Again, prioritization, which one to look at, but also having that business process behind it to really understand, okay, what do I need to do in this scenario? Have it documented, streamline the process for the engineer that's working on that particular ticket. And from there, also then feeding that back into kind of a feedback loop, go into that platform, tune out those false positives or kind of false negatives, which ones are kind of taking up the most time, and ultimately, is there a way of automating all of some of those processes as well?
Gotcha. Now, Jamie, I got to ask on this. Do attackers know that the defenders are drowning in alerts? Like, are they deliberately triggering those low level alerts to create cover? Like,
Yeah, so
is it part of
there
it?
is.
How do they know about alerts?
Yeah, so there is kind of a method in social engineering where we'll deliberately overwhelm a target to kind of set off any internal systems, for instance. Now, there's 2 points I want to split this out. So Ashley's perfectly right in what he's saying, but then there's a second part to it as well in terms of, more alerts essentially is better. Now, I'm going to give you a kind of analogy. If we look at an airport, there's like minimum of 100,000 CCTV cameras. There's no way that 4 people, 5 people in that control room are monitoring every single camera that's going on. But if something happens or if an incident happens, we can then go back and replicate exactly what happened, from the point of origin all the way through to the end perspective, or what occurred or what incident occurred. So from a social engineering perspective, we'll hit it with no malware types, no malware strings. Like, we'll literally try and set every single defense system that we can internally off to swamp you guys, right? Everybody knows, if you work in IT, I'm sure Jim, Ashley, I'm sure the rest of you guys would say that essentially, sorry, something just popped up there then from this webinar. So, but essentially, if you work in IT, it's a full-time job. Like, you live it, you breathe it. You essentially, you're an IT guy all the time. It's not 9 o'clock in the morning when you start work. It's not 5 p.m. when you finish work. Like, you constantly have it on your mind. And one of the negative downsides to it is the kind of mental health constraints as well, around the fact of having 10,000 emails all come in the morning, and you've got to cycle through it and go through it. And I'll give you an example. We utilize a business continuity solution that generates us alerts for screenshots to prove that a backup has been done. Now, we get 500 emails of verifications just on that one solution, not counting anything else that might occur. But yeah, for us, it's really good because we set all them defenses off. Then we can sneak in through the known vulnerability or the known vector that we found and that we've done research on prior to that, whether it's a legacy service or whether we've got in through a phishing campaign, or even stuff like dropping USB pens around an organization, or a third party company that processes with that company will target them. And then obviously, once we've got in, it might take you guys 5 days, 10 days, 15 days to go through all the logs and all the alert side of things. But by that time, it's too late. We've already got the information that we needed and we required. So it has the balance, the negatives, the pros, and the cons as well. But yeah, it can be far too difficult to parse the amount of stuff that we see, especially like we said from tool sprawl. Like, there's just so much data coming in, and even with the advancements with AI now, modular adding on and going through them large data sets to look for any particular risks. It kind of eases the pain a little bit, but ultimately it's still there. And I think it's always going to be there. It's just going to be one of them that needs tweaking. And then a second part to add on to it, Dave, just to finish that off, is working with the correct vendor for the implementation and the correct solution. A lot of companies or MSPs will go and buy a solution and think, no, I'm just going to configure it myself. And it only gets partly configured. It doesn't get fully configured. They use maybe 10, 15% of the entire toolset offering, but then they just haven't got the time or the resources or the financial element to do the rest of it. So it's a very difficult kind of cat and mouse way.
Gotcha. Now, Jimmy, I got to follow. You brought AI up first. Congratulations for managing. We got to 29 minutes without mentioning it, but that opens up for a follow up that I need to ask, because Wahat asked a question here that I was curious about as well. Are the AI models used in endpoint security susceptible to poisoning or manipulation by the attackers?
Yeah, so this is quite an interesting topic. So there's different types of GPT solutions. There's two main ones at the moment that are ravaging. I'm seeing them all the time in terms of different SOC reports coming out from the British government, different NIST reports as well. And one of them being is Worm GPT. So Worm GPT creates really, really advanced, complex malware distributions and allows you to target a very specific company. So you could feed in some information, for instance, for a company, the very basics like LinkedIn profile, stuff like that. And this goes out and looks through DNS records. It like finds what solution they're using. Are they using Google Workspace? Are they using Microsoft 365? And then it narrows down the particular vectors of what it's going to do in terms of malware distribution. But then you've also got Ghost GPT that then impersonates an employee within inside that organization. So it goes off again, it does all the research, it pulls all this collective data, and then it's very difficult to not tell that you're liaising with AI. It's not like the old days where Dave might have made a spelling mistake in his emails, or the images weren't rendering correctly, and we could kind of notice the differentials. Now it's so difficult. It's AI versus AI in terms of that approach. It has to be that. So from the endpoint perspective, they're becoming more and more complex. The attacks are becoming more and more complex, but also the end user, all these alerts popping up. Like, we use a solution as well internally where every time we need to run elevations for like DLLs and stuff, we have to put in a comment box to particular reasons why we need that particular DLL, for instance. So it becomes more of a hindrance, from an internal perspective, because you're constantly kind of doing that. So I hope that answered
Gotcha.
your question a little bit.
Yeah, you did, and it actually gives me a good opportunity to sort of talk about, because we've spent a lot of time talking about the problems. We've identified three massive problems here, so I want to actually start talking about fixing, like what are some of the things, and I want to start with some of that kind of layered security approach. Ashley, I got to throw it to you. Walk us through what a properly layered security strategy looks like for endpoints right now. Are there non-negotiables that every MSP should be deploying, and is there a particular order?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously there's a range of tools out there, but if you look at if you use a kind of framework-based approach, so this cybersecurity framework, first of all, you need to kind of identify what assets do you have, whether that's kind of physical devices such as your laptops, and then going across to kind of your applications, SaaS environments, having a detection capability, such as your EDR on the devices, and extending out to a kind of response capability through MDR. So we understand not everyone can have their own internal SOC team, so outsourcing that to kind of a third party such as ConnectWise, to provide that kind of 24/7 coverage of those threats and events. But also kind of the last element of that, having a backup and disaster recovery solution as well. It's all well and good kind of having all those different layers of security, but ultimately, if you're not kind of backing up that data, if those layers were to fail, you need to have a point that you can recover to. And that's where the business continuity disaster recovery solutions come in, not just backing up data, but having different methods to um, keep the organization running in the short and get them up and running again in the shortest time possible.
Gotcha. Now I got to follow up here, because I think John's brings this up, and I think it's worth bringing up for you from the technical perspective. John asks, "How is AI changing ConnectWise?" So, like Jamie talked a little bit about how the attackers are using it. How is AI changing what ConnectWise is doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So ConnectWise, we're kind of taking an AI kind of first approach of trying to integrate that as much as possible to not only cover the tools, but also the processes that we have as part of the organization. And obviously, AI has been a term that's been around for a good few years now, but we're seeing it increasingly being kind of integrated into the products we use and the way that we work. So there's various different routes we're taking, anything from natively in the platform to help return kind of results, understand kind of behaviors in terms of kind of tickets, finding resolutions. Also, in terms of the security perspective as well, we've got obviously we work with a range of solutions that identify attackers' behavior. Also, then feeding that into our SOC process as well, really understanding kind of what the threat is, how we can kind of streamline some of the response capabilities. So there's a whole range of ways that we're using it at ConnectWise.
Gotcha. Now, Jim, I got to ask because you're thinking about this from a business perspective, and I got to ask about resilience. Like, so when endpoint get compromised, and we know they will, what separates MSPs who recover in hours from those who face like days and weeks of downtime? Are there things that they should be doing now, and how does it tie back to the business relationship with the client?
I think we probably all would have a really thoughtful comment on what is the difference between an MSP that can respond in a reasonable or business necessary time frame and ones that don't. And a lot of it has to do with planning. I mean, Jamie and Ashley both had really good points on, the just the threat volumes that are coming in, the number of signals. How do we make sure we're responding to actual events and putting people on the most critical issues? It's a really big challenge. And those MSPs that can respond well, protect their clients, practice these types of activities. They understand the risks and they know how to respond and make sure they find and partner with products and services that help them really focus on those core issues, because the noise out there is massive. How do we distill that down to the threats people really need to see and then test those reactions when necessary?
Gotcha. Now I got to follow up because Frank asked something that I think you'd be the right person to ask here. Do the companies with with shadow IT problems have a company policy and procedure in place for employees?
Probably, that's the challenge with this is, you can write policies all day, and we would say a lot of things come down to people, process, and technology. Technology gets all of the views, all of the buzz because it's the cool thing that actually stops or notifies on the threat. It's the people and the process and the backside of it that make sure they work properly and do what they're supposed to do. We can write policies all day long to say use this application or don't use that application, but until we get to an enforcement position, it's just words, right? And we see this all the time. Jamie brought up a really good point on leveraging AI. We can say, hey, all right, team, we don't want you to use Chat GPT from the public side of things because we're worried about poisoning data or pushing data out into the rest of the industry. But until we enforce that, until we make sure we're leveraging applications that stop the type of activities we don't want to have happen, we're really just hoping and praying.
Gotcha. Now, Jamie, I want to ask you a little bit about, the way humans fit into this. So, even with the best technical controls, humans are the weakest link. So, how do you recommend organizations layer security awareness training with those technical controls? Like, are there particular mistakes to avoid or things that work really well from a security awareness training perspective?
Yeah, I think from at the end of the day, we're people, we're humans, right? We like interaction, we like having fun, we like talking, and we like that environment. That's what we have, that's what we strive towards. The thing that I find the most is, making it fun and interactive in terms of, the training side of things. I mean, if we look at PCI DSS compliance as an example, right, and you have to go through all that element of training and all that element of awareness internally, it's just so boring. It doesn't make you want to go through it. It's like 35 pages of just pure, do I have sticky notes? No. Okay. Do I record any card data? No. Do I do this? It's not fun. And I think a lot of organizations now, I mean, I've looked through ConnectWise's training stuff that you guys offer as well. It's interactive. It's more of kind of environment driven. It's not tailored to, just one organization where the training was effectively done. It was tailored to be able to adapt it towards multi different organizations. And I've tend to find as well, I did some training awareness a couple of weeks ago to go through for a new product that I'm trialing. And, I just skipped through it and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to click next, next, next. It's just this animated thing that I'm watching. I'm just going to answer the questions at the end and that's fine. And one of the questions were like, what color was the pumpkin? On the T-shirt of the individual that was talking. I'm like, I don't know, because I didn't pay attention. So I had to then go back through it to then find this pumpkin to get through to the next step. And I think stuff like that, again, makes it interactive. Like you have to focus, you have to kind of go through it, but it's in a really fun way. But I think one other thing as well is, how a business operates. We have loads of different complex systems, right? Database integrations, external integrations, like API integrations. There's so much. And if we look at the word cybersecurity, right, it's almost like a doctor, but you have a neurologist, a dermatologist, a pediatrician. Like you can't just say, I need a doctor. That's your first point of origin. You have to work out exactly what it is that you need. Do you need the database guys, the physical guys, the human guys, the software guys? Like we're not jack of all trades, it doesn't work like that. We have specialities. So I think once an organization understands where their core critical data is, what they're processing to get back operational in the event of a disaster, use that in terms of simulations and training methods, but just make it enjoyable. Cybersecurity doesn't need to be fun. It doesn't need to be horrible or boring. It needs to be fun and interactive, and that's what I tend to find helps the most in terms of organizations. I mean, at the end of the day, you might have shareholders and stakeholders, like they have a vested interest, they want it to succeed, but employees, they just want to go home at 5 o'clock. It's very difficult to kind of make them adapt to that mindset. So one thing that I always say is cybersecurity, it starts in your personal life. It becomes second nature in the corporate environment, but you have to want to adapt that strategy.
Gotcha. Now I'm starting to get some really good questions in here. I'm going to throw them here. John, in particular, asking about some of the compliance frameworks, DFARS, NIST, CMMC compliance. Jim, I want you to weigh in a little bit on how you frame and think about these compliance frameworks, particularly for those as like his MSP moving into the government sector.
Yeah, I think that's probably more shamed around Jim.
Okay. Yeah, Jim,
So
why don't you go ahead and grab
I'm
that
not
one
very
for
good
me?
on the compliance elements of the US,
Yeah,
but
sure.
Jim's probably clued up. So
Great.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're seeing this more and more. We're seeing MSPs, being forced to start working, or forced is probably the wrong word, being excited to work with businesses that are in the defense, the financial, or the healthcare space. You know, moving into a compliance sector for an MSP is challenging. How do they start the process? Well, you start it by being internally compliant, right? Following those NIST standards, following those CIS standards, really implementing it inside your house, because it's going to be a requirement either way. We want to make sure that whenever we're managing or supporting an organization that has these type of requirements, that we're protecting their data at the same level, if not higher. So when we go through that process as an MSP, we realize how painful it is. Now, getting to a full NIST or full CIS control level environment, we know that can be challenging. But if we're going to do that, that's kind of stage number one.
Gotcha. Now, Jim, while I've got you here, I'm going to ask you a follow up here because Simon was asking about how shadow IT affects a company's cyber insurance. Do you have some perspective there?
Great point. If we think of cyber insurance, and this is probably a long topic that I'll try to keep as short as possible, there's a lot of areas where cyber insurance does or does not cover when an incident happens, or we'll say a breach happens. We think of a ransomware event as an example. If that ransomware was started by shadow IT, maybe it's covered and maybe it's not. But that's just a piece of the puzzle. When we think of ransomware, we think of the ransomware cost, which is typically somewhere between 10 to 20% of the total impact of the business. So if I had to pay $100,000 out for a ransom event, maybe that is covered by my cyber insurance, maybe it's not. But at the end of the day, it's typically going to cost us somewhere between $1 million and $1.5 million for the total impact of the business. And those are the kind of things that we worry about. If we don't have controls in place, if we don't have protection in place, what can the cyber insurance companies do to make sure that their protection is really respective of the type of cybersecurity a company delivers? It's
Gotcha. Well,
challenging.
thank you for that. I've got one from Hanan that I think is going to be great for Ashley here. So, because he's asking specifically about what specific endpoint telemetry data does ConnectWise collect and analyze to detect those hidden threats?
So yeah, specifically probably more focusing around the EDR type of technology there, but um, from the technology perspective, the more data you have, the more of an informed decision that you can make. So collecting anything from like Windows Event Viewer, from kind of seeing what kind of commands are running on the device. Ultimately, the more data you have, the analyst that's looking at that can make more determined risk responses to is a real event positive. So it's basically the more data that the endpoint can provide, the greater the ability to respond to those type of threats.
Gotcha. Well, Ashley, well, I've got you. Ray's got a good question that I think about. Are there particular rollback or isolation options available within the platform?
Yeah, so again, it depends on the technology used, but for example, endpoint, we've got the ability to kind of kill a process, quarantine a file, but in the event that you need to contain kind of the attacker to a device, we have ability to perform that action. Ultimately, the goal is to stop an attacker as soon as possible. So if you can contain them to a device, kind of analyze how do they actually get to that point, and then almost like work backwards, kind of roll the device back to the state it was before the attack started. But again, it comes back to kind of having that visibility of what actually happened in the first place. But then also moving across to kind of the SaaS side, Microsoft 365, being able to kind of lock out a user account as well if an attacker has managed to get in through a compromised credential, token theft. There's various different methods of gaining access, but Microsoft 365 is almost kind of like the crown jewels for an attacker now. Endpoints are great, but we're moving into the cloud. Microsoft 365 is an entry point, so having the ability to respond there is also critical to these organizations.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for that. Well, Jamie, I got a question from Aaron here that I think is right up your alley because Aaron's asking about what role does user training play in reducing the endpoint risk, and how do you think it can be made more effective? So, Jamie, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on how that can be done. Can you weigh in a little bit here for me?
So automation does help, but culture massively matters more in terms. You can't automate the awareness side. So I think from the particular element, they're using that software, they're using that technology, they're on that endpoint, right? They're utilizing. If we go to the point that Ashley made there about 365, the biggest risks associated with that is allowing users to install apps directly through stuff like Outlook as a prime example. A lot of organizations have not locked that down, but allowed them to integrate stuff like LinkedIn directly into Outlook or other different types of applications. Now, in terms of that particular store, we've seen stuff in the last 12 months accidentally been published that contains malware, and then that's then being used in a corporate environment that's not being audited because there's no policy in play from the 365 perspective, which again is very difficult to have that overreach from, the IT team to be aware of what applications are installed. Or if you're an MSP, you're not going to look you're not going to look around 400 or 500 tenants that you manage and then look for all the applications that they also have as well to kind of create an audit trail. It just doesn't work. You can't do that. So it's more so the cultural side of things. What do you need and what's your requirements for your technology to be able to conduct your role within that organization, and then kind of work from that particular level. So in regards to training, so let's say someone uses Sage, for instance. There's many different account softwares, but I'll just say Sage as an example. They need an application on their machine. Okay, that talks to a database, right? When it talks to a database, are they using Sage 200, which is using a cloud-based connector? Or are they using 50? Or what's the requirements for that? From the training side, do they have to connect to remote shares to be able to manage that accounts package that they're using? So you need to really understand the roles and then make the training side fun associated with them roles. I used to have an employee in our organization, and he used to just leave files like randomly plotted around with funny names in different shares and stuff. And then the person that would then report it, like, I found this, they shouldn't have had access to that particular element. So it's a bit, just a bit of fun, really. It wasn't training per se, but so it's just making it fun. It's really important to make your employees want to invest time into the security strategy of the organization, because, like I said, they only work that period. They're not shareholders. They're not stakeholders. They don't care if the organization gets shut down because they'll just have a break for 6 months. It's fine. We've seen that recently with kind of the vehicle companies that got hacked recently. I won't mention the names, but we've seen the culture in terms of how that affected their employees' wellness, but also the knock-on effect to supply chains.
Gotcha. Now I want to let's make that value translated into something for clients, because Todd's got a question that I think Jim's going to be great for. Todd's asking about, how can MSPs better communicate the value of cybersecurity investments to clients who only see it as a cost?
That's been a challenge for quite a while now. A lot of SMBs just don't see themselves as a target. They don't quite relate some of the numbers that we throw out as the risks as their own. We have to continually go back to just general information. If we look at things like the Verizon DIBA report telling us where attacks are coming from, we get pretty good at perimeter building that wall, and maybe we can get our SMB partners to invest in external protection. But we see 32% of incidents and breaches start from within, from negligent, complacent, or malicious internal actors. Really using true stats and information storytelling always helps in the general conversation side of things. But working through our partners, helping them understand the risk. We talked about shadow IT, we talked about tool sprawl, we talked about, patching being a challenging issue. Really going through a small business and showing them where their deficiencies are, showing them where their gaps are in cybersecurity protection, and really showing out that journey is the best course of action that we can take to help protect them in the long run.
Gotcha. Okay. Now this one, Derek threw me one that I've got to throw to Jamie because this is just too fun, and I'm sure there's a good story here. So, Jamie, Derek is asking about how AI is being leveraged by attackers. Have the frequencies of attackers increased this year? I'm confident you've got a good story to tell around this one, which is why I had to pull it off the pile.
Yeah, so in terms of attacks, they're always on the increase. It's just going to be one of the things that we have to get used to. And even the cultural side of things as well, it's becoming the normality to see in the news that companies have been breached. We're not like shocked anymore. We've not got that fear factor anymore. It's just an average way of life of what we're seeing. From the AI perspective, it doesn't stop you from downloading like a model, for instance, and then just teaching it how to be bad, essentially, running it in your own environment and then utilizing that. And back when I was growing up, like I'm autistic, so I resonate with technology. I always have, that's my thing, right? And when we were growing up, we didn't care about the data element, right? But nowadays, data is far more valuable than currency. We'd kind of break in, we'd leave our thing, we'd have a look around, and we'd disappear. That was it. That was all we essentially enjoyed doing. But now you've got people that are sitting within organizations for, in one instance, I was involved with a breach that they had access for nearly 4 years before they realized what was going on. And what happened was this individual used to manage their backup solutions. They had a really old FTP solution that they were using to back up as like a secondary type backup that they completely forgot about. It was part of their endpoint that you could see it in their solutions that they were using, but they had no idea. They were worried and scared essentially to figure it out and just kind of left it. And this employee was dialing in from another organization that did the same thing, and he was stealing chip schematics. And then he was climbing the ranks in the other company with the schematics from the rival company just by dialing in again. Having this software, on internally. And again, if we kind of look at some statistics, this is from Verizon again. 1/3 of patches were delayed because IT feared breaking production systems. And this is another thing that you see as well with MSPs. Like, I'm a bit worried. Should we do it? Should we press it? Like, you need to kind of get over the mindset that you have the vendors, you have the right people, you have the right integrations, the technologies. You've just got to play on your assets of strengths that you've got around you. So yeah, AI is definitely getting more complex, even in terms of like looking for financial information or like secure documentation, or a lot of companies, like I said, they'll buy a specific solution, but they'll implement 10% of it, and they haven't got the time for the other 90% of it, and that's where the weakness relies there. So yeah, you need to look at AI technologies definitely moving forward.
Gotcha. That's some really good guidance. Now, Ashley, I gotta ask you because Austin's got a question. He's asked you to weigh in, and I think this is an interesting one for you to weigh in. So Austin asks: is it better for organizations when growing in size to invest more in their existing MDE systems and upgrade their services, or continue to layer and explore additional applications and subscriptions? I want you to weigh in on a tech perspective from that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think obviously it's about reviewing what you've got currently. Can it kind of upgrade to have these additional capabilities? Because it's all well and good being able to explore different kind of applications and different technologies, but it's kind of how those technologies integrate to what you've currently got. Because otherwise, we go back to kind of the problem that we've talked about a good few times today in terms of that tool sprawl, that kind of silos of data. So if if the current technology is good, it's working for you, that's great. Does it have additional capabilities you can bolt on? Even better. But it's also a case of reviewing that periodically as well. Obviously, technology is never stagnant. There's always different development routes that it's going through, and how that's working for your organization as you kind of look at the cybersecurity maturity as well. It might work great kind of to start with, like we've gone through the transition of AV to EDR. I'm sure there's another term we'll be using in a few years that we'll put on top of that. But yeah, it's a case of reviewing what you've got. Potentially, can you bolt on additional capabilities? But also, how that feeds back into the platforms you're using today and the business processes around that as well.
Gotcha. Now trying to be careful with time here. Jamie, I've got one from Philip that I think would be really useful to get your perspective as a breach investigator. So Philip asks, how critical are endpoint audit trails and forensic logging in breach investigations and regulatory reporting for sectors like education, healthcare, and fintech?
Really critical. So if we take the healthcare, for instance, or in fact, let's use the kind of finance sectors, right? So every 3 years, I know in the United Kingdom, every 3 years we have different frameworks that get rolled out. Now, one thing that I've always kind of argued about is these particular frameworks were created for an organization that was audited. So an auditor's gone out, they've decided this is what we're going to do for the next, obviously liaised with their team, and then rolled that out. But one thing that's always kind of bothered me is, that was created for that company during that audit to be the next step. It's not for every organization. A lot of companies integrate with different systems, different technologies, different providers. Like, you can't just follow that framework and just be like, okay, well, my company's secure. You need to adapt and kind of, create different elements of layered security within that particular framework set that's relevant for your organization. But even like, if we look at the healthcare of how we kind of store information, so I'll give you a really interesting one. And this is for me, it's very fun, but for you guys, maybe not. But I do amateur radio. So I've been doing that for a very, very long time. There's a certain frequency that you can listen to that intercepts something called POGSAC. So do some research. POGSAC is an old data system for like firefighters getting a call out and a bleep for the pager. But what you didn't realize is here in the United Kingdom and in Europe, there is tens of thousands of these signals coming out of healthcare systems showing stuff like patient records, patient information, organ transfer and transplant. And this is a really old solution from like 1980s and 90s that's still being used and operated today. So again, that to me is a breach of GDPR, but it's just something that they live with. They just accept. They don't disable because it has a requirement for something else that they use. So again, it goes to the levels that you guys, essentially need within your organization. But I would follow the framework, but I'd massively adapt it to your organization. That's the key important factor. What a lot of this stuff is public available information, right? The frameworks are public in a sense of depending on what infrastructure or what industry that you're in. But from an attacker, they can go through that and use it as a checklist to kind of work out, okay, well, they might have this, they might have this, they might have this, but they haven't got this. And that's the way, and it's thinking outside the box.
Gotcha. Now, Jim, I'm going to throw you the last question because Lenny threw me one that I think is perfect for us to end on. Like Lenny asked specifically, what is the best tool that ConnectWise has that can support the idea of storytelling to help get the point across?
When we think of holistic protection, right, one of the challenges we have is we've talked about a lot of different things today, and this could almost invoke tool sprawl just with the different protections we've talked about. When we think of that holistic story, what we want to talk about is how do we centralize this? How do we give MSPs a simple way of leveraging and protecting their organizations? When we think of the RMM side, to be able to discover what's out there and make sure things are patched. When we think of MDR, to really protect from those external threats, and then that ability to recover. When we think about those three simple steps, we've really protected an organization from a lot of threats. Not nearly all of them. There's more to discuss, but that's kind of that first step in providing a good layer of protection.
Gotcha. Well, gents, this has been fantastic. I want to be respectful of everybody's time and our attendees' time to make sure that I end on time here. Jim, Jamie, Ashley, thank you so much for your insights here. We've given people a lot to think about, both of the threats, but some actionable direction on what they can do. From a reminder perspective, everybody that attended will go ahead and get a version of this recording emailed to you in a couple of days. Make sure to review the ConnectWise website to get upcoming webinars and additional things you can register to continue to get that educational information. If you're more interested in more stuff from me, you can visit businessof.tech to check out the podcast and all the stuff that I'm doing, and we will continue those conversations ongoing. Really appreciate all of you joining me today for this webinar sponsored by ConnectWise. Thanks for joining me for the Business of Tech Lounge, and I will see you next time. Want more from the Business of Tech? Join Business of Tech Plus for ad-free episodes, early interviews, extended cuts, subscriber-only shows, and exclusive member perks and analysis. Sign up at businessof.tech/plus. And follow this show in your podcast app, and if you're on YouTube, hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a story. Reviews and comments help spread the word too. Interested in advertising? Head to mspradio.com/engage. The Business of Tech is written and produced by me, Dave Sobel, under ethics guidelines posted at businessof.tech. Thanks for listening. I'll see you on the next episode.